The morning of February 11th, 1943. Off the Solomon Islands, the sea is black beneath a moonless sky. Aboard the destroyer USS Fletcher, radar operator Robert Thompson watches his scope with practiced attention. A blip materializes 15,000 yards out, moving on the surface. The contact is sharp, unmistakable. In the Combat Information Center, the call goes out. Target bearing 270, range decreasing. On the bridge, the captain orders battle stations. Below decks, depth charge crews scramble to their stations. The destroyer heels into a turn, white water boiling from her stern as she accelerates to 35 knots. The target is the Japanese submarine I-18. Her commander, a veteran of Pearl Harbor, has surfaced to recharge batteries. His lookouts scan the darkness, seeing nothing. They cannot know that invisible radio waves are already painting their hull, that a ship they cannot see is closing at over 40 miles per hour. In the submarine's conning tower, no alarm sounds, no warning comes. The first indication of danger arrives as star shells burst overhead, turning night into terrible noon. By then, Fletcher is already within gun range, her 5-inch batteries trained and ready. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. 20 minutes later, I-18 is gone, sent to the bottom by depth charges dropped with mathematical precision. Her crew of 96 men never had a chance to fight back. They barely had time to realize they were under attack. This was not supposed to happen. Japanese naval doctrine had prepared their submariners for many scenarios: surface gun duels, torpedo exchanges, evasion techniques perfected in peacetime exercises. But being detected from beyond visual range in total darkness, tracked by invisible means, and destroyed before even seeing the enemy, this was something new, something their training had not covered. For the previous 2 years, Japanese naval planners had watched American destroyer construction with a mixture of contempt and amusement. The Americans, they concluded, were building obsolete ships, too slow compared to Japanese destroyers like the Fubuki class, which could make 35 knots in calm seas. Undergunned compared to ships that carried the deadly Type 93 Long Lance torpedo, a weapon that could strike from 20 miles away with devastating accuracy. The American destroyers being laid down in 1941 and 42 seemed to Japanese eyes like an admission of industrial desperation rather than tactical innovation. Quantity over quality. The American way. This assessment was not without foundation. Before 1942, American destroyers had struggled. The older classes, the Bensons, the Gleaves, the Sims, were top-heavy, cramped, and limited in range. When war came to the Pacific in December 1941, Japanese destroyers had proven themselves superior in night combat, their Long Lance torpedoes devastating American formations at Savo Island and elsewhere. In surface actions during the Guadalcanal campaign, Japanese destroyers consistently outperformed their American counterparts. The lesson seemed clear. American destroyer design was fundamentally flawed. The Americans were playing catch-up in a game where Japan had already established the rules. What Japanese naval intelligence failed to understand was that the Americans were not trying to catch up. They were changing the game entirely. The Fletcher Class destroyer, first commissioned in June 1942, was designed for a war that neither nation had yet learned to fight, a war where electronic detection mattered more than visual sighting, where systematic prosecution of contacts mattered more than individual ship speed, where the patient hunter would prevail over the aggressive warrior. The Fletcher class was large, at 2,050 tons, standard displacement, and nearly 3,000 tons fully loaded. These destroyers dwarfed their predecessors. The extra size solved a problem that had plagued American destroyer design for 2 decades: stability. Previous classes had been built to peacetime treaty limits, cramming as much capability as possible into 1,500 tons. The result was ships that rolled dangerously in heavy seas and couldn't accommodate new equipment without becoming top-heavy. The Fletchers, freed from treaty restrictions that had lapsed in 1936, had room to grow, and grow they did. The visible armament was respectable but not revolutionary. 5 5-inch guns in single mounts, 10 torpedo tubes in 2 centerline quintuple mounts, depth charges, and anti-aircraft weapons. On paper, this was roughly equivalent to what Japan was building, but the invisible armament, the electronic sensors that Japanese planners either didn't know about or didn't understand, made all the difference. The SG surface search radar, mounted above the bridge, could detect a surfaced submarine at 15,000 yards or more. At night, in a storm, with absolute precision, the radar operator could determine range and bearing to within a fraction of a degree, feeding this information directly to the ship's guns and depth charge directors. For the first time in naval history, darkness was no longer a submarine's ally. Complementing the radar was improved sonar equipment, the QC set, which could track submerged contacts with unprecedented accuracy. Earlier, American sonar had been crude, barely capable of distinguishing a submarine from a whale or a temperature layer. The QC sonar was different. It could hold a contact through evasive maneuvers, could estimate depth, could guide the ship into perfect attack position. And once in position, the Fletcher class carried weapons that earlier destroyers could only dream of. The standard depth charge armament consisted of 2 stern racks holding 6 charges each and 6 K-gun throwers amidships. Each charge contained 300 pounds of high explosive, but it was the firing pattern that made the difference. Using sonar data and mathematical tables developed through hard experience in the Atlantic, Fletcher-class crews could drop charges in precise patterns designed to bracket a submarine's probable position. No more guesswork, no more random saturation. Each attack was calculated, methodical, deadly. By early 1943, Fletcher-class destroyers were arriving in the Pacific in steadily increasing numbers. 25 had been commissioned by the end of 1942. 40 more would join the fleet in 1943. By the end of the war, 175 would be in service, the largest class of destroyers ever built by any nation. They were built by 11 different shipyards across the United States, each ship taking an average of 364 days from keel laying to commissioning. By comparison, Japanese shipyards were producing perhaps a dozen destroyers per year. The industrial disparity was becoming impossible to ignore, but numbers alone did not sink submarines. It was the combination of sensors, weapons, training, and doctrine that made the Fletcher class so lethal. American destroyer crews in the Pacific were learning hard lessons from their counterparts fighting U-boats in the Atlantic. The Royal Navy had spent 3 years perfecting anti-submarine tactics against German submarines, developing procedures for prosecuting contacts, coordinating attacks, and maintaining persistent pressure on submerged contacts. These lessons were transmitted across the Atlantic, refined in training centers in San Diego and Pearl Harbor, and put into practice by Fletcher-class crews who understood that patience and precision mattered more than aggressive pursuit. For Japanese submarine commanders, the change was bewildering. In 1942, their boats had operated with relative impunity. American destroyers would occasionally stumble upon them, leading to brief, inconclusive exchanges. More often, Japanese submarines could surface at night, run their diesel engines to recharge batteries, and slip away before dawn. The Pacific was vast, the darkness was absolute, and the odds of random encounter were comfortingly low. By mid-1943, everything had changed. Submarines that surfaced at night found themselves illuminated by star shells fired from destroyers they hadn't known were there. Submarines running submerged detected the ominous ping of active sonar, not the diffuse, easily evaded sonar of 1941, but precise, persistent, professional tracking that followed them through every evasive maneuver. And then came the depth charges, not scattered randomly but placed with surgical accuracy, the patterns tightening with each attack run until the submarine's pressure hull buckled and the ocean rushed in. The numbers told the story. In 1942, Fletcher Class Destroyers sank 3 Japanese submarines. In 1943, as more ships joined the fleet and crews gained experience, the number climbed to 12. By 1944, Japanese submarines were being hunted to extinction. The Fletcher class would ultimately account for 29 Japanese submarine kills during the war, a record unmatched by any other destroyer class in history. But statistics alone cannot capture what it meant for Japanese submarine crews to realize they were being hunted by an enemy they could neither see nor effectively fight. Japanese submarine doctrine, refined over 2 decades, was built on the assumption that submarines would operate as scouts and attackers for the main battle fleet. They would locate American carrier groups, shadow them, report their positions, and launch torpedo attacks when opportunity arose. This required large, fast submarines with extended range and good surface speed submarines that could keep pace with carrier groups and maintain communications with fleet headquarters. The Japanese had built exactly that. The I-class submarines were monsters by any standard. Some displaced over 3,000 tons surfaced, carried crews of 100 men, and could cruise for 20,000 miles without refueling. Many carried floatplane aircraft for reconnaissance. They were designed to operate far from home, to range across the Pacific seeking battle, to engage American warships in open ocean combat. What they were not designed for was evading systematic anti-submarine warfare by an enemy equipped with radar and modern sonar. The very features that made Japanese submarines excellent fleet scouts made them vulnerable to Fletcher-class hunters. Large size meant large radar signatures. Good surface speed meant frequent surfacing to recharge batteries. Extended range meant long transit times through waters increasingly patrolled by American destroyers. And the doctrine of aggressive fleet support meant Japanese submarines often had to operate in areas where American ships were most concentrated, precisely where Fletcher-class destroyers were most numerous. The first indication that something was seriously wrong came in early 1943, when submarine loss rates began to climb. Initially, Japanese naval headquarters attributed this to bad luck or aggressive American patrol patterns. Submarines were lost in combat. This was expected. But as the months passed and the losses mounted, a pattern emerged. Submarines were being caught on the surface at night. They were being tracked and destroyed by depth charges delivered with unnerving accuracy. And they were encountering American destroyers in areas where random contact should have been highly unlikely. The truth was simple but devastating. The Americans were hunting submarines with electronic sensors that made darkness irrelevant, and with weapons that made evasion nearly impossible. The Fletcher-class destroyer represented a fundamental evolution in naval warfare, and Japanese submarine doctrine had no answer for it. On April 5, 1943, the submarine WWII encountered this reality firsthand. Patrolling off the Solomon Islands, she surfaced shortly after midnight to recharge batteries. The night was dark, the sea calm. Her lookouts reported nothing. Then, from nowhere, an American destroyer appeared at close range, so close that WWII's captain attempted to ram her rather than dive. The destroyer was USS O'Bannon, a Fletcher-class ship that had detected WWII on radar from over 10 miles away and closed to visual range before the submarine even knew she was there. What happened next entered naval legend. O'Bannon was moving too fast to bring her guns to bear, and WWII pulled alongside so close that the destroyer's main battery couldn't depress enough to hit her. For a surreal moment, Japanese sailors on the submarine's deck and American sailors on the destroyer's rails stared at each other across a few yards of water. Then, someone on O'Bannon began throwing potatoes, the only projectiles immediately at hand. Whether the Japanese mistook them for hand grenades or were simply startled by the absurdity, they abandoned their deck gun and scrambled below. O'Bannon pulled ahead, gained distance, and destroyed WWII with gunfire and depth charges. The potato story became famous. But its significance lay not in the vegetables, but in the hunt that preceded them. O'Bannon had detected, tracked, and intercepted Row 34 using radar and systematic patrol patterns. The submarine never had a chance to dive, never had an opportunity to employ her torpedoes, never even realized she was being hunted until the moment of contact. This was the new reality of submarine warfare in the Pacific. The initiative had shifted irrevocably to the hunters. By late 1943, Japanese submarine commanders were reporting increasingly desperate situations. Destroyers appeared where none should be. Night surface runs became deadly gambles. Even submerged transit was no longer safe, as American destroyers would detect, track, and prosecute contacts with methodical efficiency. The Japanese submarine force, which had begun the war as one of the world's largest and most capable, was being systematically destroyed. And the destroyers doing the destroying were the same ships Japanese planners had dismissed as obsolete just 18 months earlier. The Fletcher class had proven that modern naval warfare was not about top speed or torpedo range. It was about sensors, coordination, and the ability to detect and destroy enemies who didn't even know they were being hunted. The Americans had built a destroyer for the war they were actually fighting, while the Japanese were still fighting the war they had planned for in 1937. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The sinking of I-18 inches February and Row 34 inches April were merely the beginning. As 1943 progressed, Fletcher-class destroyers across the Pacific were refining their anti-submarine techniques, sharing lessons learned, and building a systematic approach to submarine hunting that would ultimately prove unstoppable. Every encounter taught new lessons, every kill validated new tactics, and with each passing month, more Fletcher-class destroyers joined the fleet, spreading across the Pacific like a net pulling inexorably tighter. Japanese naval headquarters struggled to adapt. They issued new procedures for submarine operations, deeper diving when possible, stricter radio silence, avoidance of areas with high destroyer concentrations. But these measures were inadequate. The Fletcher-class destroyers weren't hunting randomly. They were stationed along known submarine transit routes, covering approach channels to American-held islands, screening carrier task forces, and providing persistent anti-submarine patrols in areas where Japanese submarines had to operate. The technology gap was simply too wide. A Fletcher-class destroyer with working radar could detect a surfaced submarine from 15,000 yards, nearly 8 nautical miles in complete darkness. From that range, the destroyer could close to attack position in less than 20 minutes, while the submarine remained completely unaware of the threat. Even if the submarine dove immediately upon sighting, the destroyer's sonar could usually regain contact and prosecute an attack. The mathematics were brutal: detection at long range, rapid closure, precise attack. The submarine's traditional advantages, stealth, darkness, vast ocean expanses, had been negated by electronics and tactics. What made the situation even more hopeless for Japanese submarines was the sheer number of Fletcher-class destroyers being produced. By the end of 1943, over 60 were in service. By mid-1944, the number exceeded 120. They were everywhere screening carriers, escorting convoys, conducting anti-submarine sweeps, supporting amphibious operations. For a Japanese submarine commander, the probability of encountering a Fletcher-class destroyer on any given patrol was approaching certainty, and each encounter favored the destroyer overwhelmingly. The Fletcher class was faster on the surface than any submarine. It had longer endurance, fuel capacity of over 75,000 gallons, allowing operations for weeks without refueling. Its crew of 300 men could maintain watch schedules indefinitely. Its sensors never slept. A submarine, by contrast, had to surface regularly to recharge batteries, exposing itself to radar detection. It had limited underwater endurance, perhaps 48 hours at slow speed before batteries were exhausted. Its crew operated in cramped, exhausting conditions that degraded performance over time. In any sustained hunt, the advantage lay entirely with the destroyer. Japanese submarine doctrine had assumed that submarines would be the hunters, seeking out American carrier groups and battleships for torpedo attacks. The reality was the exact opposite. Submarines had become the hunted, forced into defensive operations, spending more time evading destroyers than attacking targets. The psychological impact was devastating. Submarine crews who had trained for aggressive fleet operations found themselves running from destroyers they couldn't see, detected by means they couldn't counter, attacked by weapons they couldn't evade. The I-class submarines, Japan's pride, were particularly vulnerable. Their large size made them easy radar targets. Their relatively slow dive time, over a minute to reach safety, gave Fletcher Class destroyers ample opportunity to close the range and get sonar contact. Their requirement to surface frequently for battery charging meant more exposure to radar detection, and their mission profiles, ranging far from base to scout for American forces, put them directly in the path of Fletcher Class destroyer screens, protecting those same American forces. By early 1944, the pattern was unmistakable. Japanese submarine losses had accelerated to the point where operational effectiveness was collapsing. In January alone, 4 submarines failed to return from patrol. In February, 3 more were lost. These were not small coastal boats or aging reserve vessels. These were frontline I-class submarines, each representing an enormous investment in resources and trained personnel. Each loss removed not just a submarine, but 90 to 100 highly trained sailors, men who had spent years mastering their craft, who could not be quickly replaced. The statistics were damning. In the 18-month period from early 1943 through mid-1944, Fletcher-class destroyers sank 29 Japanese submarines. To put this in context, the entire Japanese submarine force at the start of the war numbered approximately 60 boats. The Fletcher class alone was destroying nearly half the original force, and replacements could not keep pace. Japanese shipyards were producing perhaps 4 to 6 new submarines per year. American shipyards were producing more Fletcher class destroyers every month than Japan was producing submarines all year. The mathematical reality was inescapable. At current loss rates, the Japanese submarine force would cease to exist as an effective fighting arm within 2 years, and there was no solution in sight. The technology gap that enabled Fletcher-class dominance was not something that could be quickly closed. Japan had no equivalent to American radar. Japanese sonar was primitive by comparison. Japanese depth charges were less powerful and less accurately delivered, and Japanese anti-submarine doctrine barely existed. They had spent 2 decades preparing to attack, not defend against submarine warfare. Consider the case of I-176, lost in May 1944. She was attempting to intercept American shipping near the Marshall Islands when she encountered a Fletcher-class destroyer screen protecting a convoy. The destroyers detected I-176 on radar while she was surfacing at night, over 12 miles away. 3 destroyers converged on her position using coordinated movements directed from the lead ship's Combat Information Center. By the time I-176's lookout spotted the first destroyer, all 3 were within gun range. I-176 crash-dived, but the destroyers had already established sonar contact. They prosecuted the contact for 45 minutes, taking turns making attack runs while the others maintained sonar tracking. The depth charge patterns were precise, methodical, and devastating. I-176 was forced deeper and deeper until her pressure hull failed at 400 feet. She imploded instantly, killing all hands. What made this engagement typical rather than exceptional was the systematic nature of the hunt. The destroyers did not stumble upon I-176 by chance. They detected her electronically, coordinated their response, and executed a textbook prosecution of the contact. This was repeated hundreds of times across the Pacific as Fletcher Class destroyers encountered Japanese submarines. The outcome was rarely in doubt. Japanese submarine commanders attempted various countermeasures. Some tried running submerged during daylight and only surfacing in bad weather when radar effectiveness might be reduced. This strategy reduced battery life and operational range, forcing submarines to spend more time transiting and less time on station. Others attempted to surface in areas of heavy rain, hoping the precipitation would mask their radar signature. This sometimes worked, but it also reduced visibility for the submarine's own lookouts and made navigation hazardous. Still others tried diving as soon as darkness fell and remaining submerged until dawn, but battery capacity made this impossible for more than 1 or 2 nights before recharging became mandatory. None of these measures addressed the fundamental problem. Fletcher-class destroyers could detect submarines at ranges where the submarine had no ability to detect the destroyer. Even if a submarine's lookouts were exceptionally alert, even if the night was perfectly clear, human eyes could not see 15,000 yards in darkness. By the time a lookout spotted a destroyer, the destroyer had already been tracking the submarine for 10 or 15 minutes. The initiative belonged entirely to the hunter. The Japanese tried to learn from their losses, but information was scarce. Submarines that were sunk obviously could not report what had happened to them. Submarines that survived encounters with Fletcher-class destroyers often had only fragmentary information. They had been detected somehow, attacked somehow, and had barely escaped. The systematic nature of American anti-submarine warfare remained opaque to Japanese intelligence. They knew their submarines were dying at unprecedented rates, but they didn't fully understand why. Part of the problem was cultural. The Imperial Japanese Navy had built its doctrine around aggressive, offensive action. The idea of patient, methodical hunting was alien to their tradition. Japanese destroyers were designed for high-speed torpedo attacks, not slow, careful sonar searches. Japanese naval officers trained for decisive battles, not grinding attrition. The Fletcher class represented a different philosophy entirely, one that prioritized effectiveness over glory, patience over aggression, systematic prosecution over bold action. This philosophical gap was evident in how each navy employed its destroyers. Japanese destroyers spent the war primarily supporting fleet operations, conducting high-speed runs to reinforce island garrisons, and engaging in surface actions. Anti-submarine warfare was a secondary mission at best. American destroyers, by contrast, spent the majority of their time screening carriers and convoys, conducting anti-submarine patrols, and providing area defense. The Fletcher class was optimized for exactly this mission profile. Its range allowed extended patrols, its sensors allowed detection and tracking, its weapons allowed prosecution, and its numbers allowed persistent coverage of vast ocean areas. By mid-1944, Japanese submarines were being used less and less for offensive operations and more for supply runs to isolated garrisons. This was an admission of defeat in all but name. Submarines, which should have been stalking American carriers and cutting supply lines, were instead reduced to hauling rice and ammunition to bypassed islands. It was an enormous waste of a strategic asset, but Japanese commanders had few alternatives. Surface ships attempting supply runs were slaughtered by American aircraft and submarines. Submarines, at least, had some chance of getting through, but even supply runs were becoming suicidal. Fletcher-class destroyers patrolled the approaches to Japanese-held islands, waiting for submarines to surface near their destinations. The pattern was predictable. A submarine would approach an island, wait for darkness, surface to deliver supplies, and become a radar contact on a destroyer's scope. The engagement that followed was almost formulaic: radar detection at long range, high-speed approach, submarine spotted by lookouts too late to dive, gunfire, depth charges, sinking, repeat. The loss of Ione 169 inches, April 1944, illustrated this perfectly. She was attempting to deliver supplies to a garrison on Truk when she was detected by USS O'Bannon, the same destroyer that had sunk Roe 34 13 months earlier. O'Bannon picked up I-169 on radar at 14,000 yards, closed to 6,000 yards before being spotted, and opened fire with her 5-inch guns. I-169 attempted to dive but was caught by depth charges as she submerged. She sank with all hands, the supplies she carried going down with her. For O'Bannon's crew, this was routine. They had refined their anti-submarine procedures through dozens of engagements. Their radar operators could distinguish submarine contacts from surface ships or small craft. Their sonar operators could hold contacts through evasive maneuvers. Their depth charge crews could calculate and execute attack patterns with mechanical precision. They were professionals prosecuting a mission they had trained for extensively. For I-169's crew, the engagement was a terrifying blur of detection, surprise, and annihilation. The human cost of this technological and tactical disparity was staggering. Each Japanese submarine carried between 80 and 120 men, depending on the class. When a submarine was sunk, there were rarely survivors. Depth charge attacks that breached a submarine's pressure hull caused instant flooding at depths where escape was impossible. Submarines that were forced too deep imploded from water pressure, killing everyone aboard in milliseconds. Even submarines hit on the surface by gunfire usually sank too quickly for effective evacuation. The death was total, absolute, and frequent. By the summer of 1944, the Japanese submarine force was a shadow of its former self. Of the 60 submarines that had begun the war, fewer than 30 remained operational. New construction barely replaced losses. Training pipelines could not produce crew replacements fast enough, and morale among submarine crews was approaching collapse. Men volunteered for submarine service, expecting to hunt American warships in open ocean. Instead, they found themselves hunted by invisible enemies, dying in the dark without ever seeing what killed them. The Fletcher Class Destroyers, meanwhile, were everywhere. By June 1944, over 130 were in service. They screened the carriers that struck the Marianas. They protected the amphibious forces that invaded Saipan. They patrolled the sea lanes between American-held islands, interdicting Japanese submarine movements. They covered convoy routes, making submarine attacks on supply shipping nearly impossible. The Pacific had become an ocean where Japanese submarines could not operate safely anywhere. American forces had presence, which was increasingly everywhere that mattered. Some Japanese submarines attempted to avoid Fletcher-class destroyers by operating in remote areas far from American concentrations, but this strategy defeated the purpose of having submarines in the first place. A submarine that avoided all contact with the enemy contributed nothing to the war effort. And even in remote areas, Fletcher-class destroyers had a disconcerting habit of appearing. Their long range allowed them to patrol vast distances, their endurance allowed them to remain on station for weeks, and their numbers meant that even dispersed patrol areas were covered. The technological advantages that made Fletcher-class destroyers so lethal were also largely immune to countermeasures. Radar could not be jammed, the technology for electronic warfare did not yet exist in any practical form. Sonar could be confused by temperature layers or schools of fish, but experienced operators could distinguish false contacts from real submarines. Depth charges could not be evaded once a submarine was localized. The pressure wave from a 300-pound charge was lethal at 50 feet and damaging at 100. A submarine that was detected and tracked was, more often than not, a submarine that was doomed. The broader strategic implications were profound. Japanese submarine ineffectiveness meant that American supply lines across the Pacific were essentially secure. Convoys carrying troops, ammunition, fuel, and supplies from Pearl Harbor to forward bases suffered minimal losses to submarine attack. This allowed the American advance across the Pacific to maintain momentum. Each island captured became a base for further operations. Each base supported more ships, more aircraft, more troops, and each step forward was supported by Fletcher Class destroyers, ensuring that Japanese submarines could not interdict the supply chain. Contrast this with the German U-boat campaign in the Atlantic, where submarines came close to severing Britain's supply lines. At the height of the Battle of the Atlantic, U-boats were sinking ships faster than the Allies could build them. German submarine tactics were innovative, aggressive, and highly effective. German submarines sank millions of tons of shipping and tied down enormous Allied resources in convoy protection. The Japanese submarine force accomplished nothing comparable, despite having submarines that were in many ways superior to German U-boats. The difference was doctrine and employment. German submarines were unleashed against merchant shipping with clear instructions to maximize tonnage sunk. Japanese submarines were held back for fleet operations that rarely materialized. German submarines operated with tactical flexibility, adapting quickly to Allied countermeasures. Japanese submarines operated under rigid doctrine that prioritized communications with headquarters over tactical initiative. German submarine commanders were encouraged to be bold and independent. Japanese submarine commanders were expected to follow orders and maintain strict radio discipline, which often left them unaware of changing tactical situations. But even if Japanese doctrine had been different, the Fletcher-class destroyer would have posed an insurmountable challenge. The combination of radar, sonar, depth charges, and systematic training created a weapon system that was simply too effective. German U-boats, even with all their tactical flexibility and aggressive employment, were ultimately defeated by Allied anti-submarine warfare techniques, many of which were similar to what Fletcher-class destroyers were employing in the Pacific. The Japanese submarine force, starting from a disadvantaged doctrinal position and facing an enemy with superior technology, never had a chance. By the fall of 1944, Japanese submarine operations had effectively ceased as a strategic factor. The submarines that remained were husbanding their strength, avoiding unnecessary risk, and accomplishing little. Some were stationed near the Philippines in anticipation of American invasion, but their effectiveness was minimal. During the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, Japanese submarines made several attempts to attack American carrier groups, but were driven off by Fletcher-class destroyer screens without inflicting significant damage. The decisive naval battle that Japanese submarine doctrine had been built around finally occurred, and Japanese submarines were irrelevant to the outcome. The final 18 months of the war saw Japanese submarines reduced to insignificance. A few continued to operate, conducting occasional attacks, delivering supplies to bypassed garrisons, and evacuating personnel from doomed positions. But as an offensive weapon threatening American operations, they had ceased to matter. Fletcher-class destroyers and other anti-submarine platforms had made the Pacific safe for American naval operations. The irony was complete. Japanese naval planners who had mocked American destroyers as obsolete in 1941 watched their submarine force destroyed by those same obsolete ships. The Fletcher class, dismissed as slow and underarmed by officers who believed in decisive battle and torpedo range, proved to be exactly the destroyer the Pacific War required. It combined range for extended operations, sensors for detection and tracking, weapons for prosecution, and most importantly, a design philosophy that prioritized effectiveness over theoretical performance. The Americans had built a destroyer for the war. They were actually fighting a war of attrition, logistics, and systematic destruction of enemy capability. The Japanese had built submarines for the war. They wanted to fight a war of decisive fleet engagement, where submarines would serve as scouts and harassers for battleship groups. When those two visions collided, there was only one possible outcome. The 29 submarines sunk by Fletcher-class destroyers represented more than just hulls sent to the bottom. Each represented a failure of doctrine, a demonstration that aggressive warrior spirit could not overcome technological and tactical superiority, and proof that modern naval warfare belonged to those who understood electronics and systematic operations. The Fletcher Class destroyer did not win glory through bold action or daring attacks. It won through patient hunting, methodical prosecution, and the relentless application of superior sensors and weapons. By the time Japan surrendered in August 1945, only a handful of operational submarines remained. The force that had begun the war as one of the world's largest and most capable had been reduced to near total irrelevance. American submarine operations against Japanese merchant shipping are well remembered. Over 5 million tons sunk, crippling Japan's economy. Japanese submarine operations against American shipping are barely footnotes. Less than 1 million tons sunk across the entire war. The disparity reflected not just different targets, but fundamentally different levels of effectiveness. And a significant part of that ineffectiveness was the simple fact that Japanese submarines could not operate safely in American-controlled waters. Fletcher-class destroyers made sure of that. They patrolled, they hunted, they detected, they killed, repeatedly, systematically, effectively. The destroyers that Japanese planners had called obsolete proved to be one of the most successful warship classes ever built. 175 were completed during the war. 19 were lost in combat, a respectable survival rate given the intensity of Pacific fighting. The remainder served through the war, and many continued serving for decades afterward, some remaining active until the early 2000s. The Fletcher class was not the most advanced destroyer of World War II. Later classes, like the Sumner and Gearing, were improvements on the basic design. But the Fletcher was the most successful present at the right time, in the right numbers, with the right combination of capabilities for the war actually being fought. It turned the submarine from hunter into hunted, made nighttime surface runs suicidal, and helped secure the sea lanes that allowed American forces to advance across the Pacific. The Japanese submarine force learned too late that the nature of naval warfare had changed. Electronic detection mattered more than visual sighting. Systematic prosecution mattered more than bold attacks. Patient hunting mattered more than aggressive pursuit. The Fletcher class embodied these principles, and Japanese submarines paid the price for their nation's failure to understand the new reality. 29 submarines sunk in 18 months, each one a testament to how completely the tactical calculus had shifted. For the sailors who served aboard Fletcher-class destroyers, the anti-submarine campaign was often tedious, sometimes terrifying, and occasionally satisfying. They spent long hours at battle stations waiting for contacts that might never come. They prosecuted sonar returns that turned out to be whales or temperature layers. They endured the monotony of convoy, escort, and patrol duty. But when contact was made, when the radar operator called out a bearing and range, when the sonar pinged back a solid return, when the depth charges rolled off the stern, and the ocean erupted in massive explosions, then they knew they were doing exactly what their ships had been designed to do. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.